Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today, my guest is James Furey, high school teacher and Twitter poster who often gives, shall we say, an unorthodox position or takes on current educational patterns and fads. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
How are things going for you?
They're going well. Just living the home life thing. Got my weekend off from school. Just kind of plying my way through the year right now. So.
And how are things going for you on Twitter? You said you just went viral for the first time.
Yeah, I've seen steady growth for a while, but I never had a spike like I did a couple weeks ago. Now I think a couple weeks ago. I've been kind of a workman-like sort of account, just kind of gaining little by little. So it was interesting to see, just kind of marvel at how the numbers just exploded on this one thing that I had said. And it was unexpected, but I guess welcome.
What did you say that got people's interest?
Well, I believe I said something along the lines that every teacher knows there are 2 or 3 students who, if you removed from the classroom, everything else would go a little bit more smoothly. And I said, the problem is we don't really have the will to make these tough decisions. And
what did people say in response?
Well, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive, but any negative form was mostly about, well, where do you put these kids after that? If you remove them, then what happens to them? I think it's a serious point to ask. But I also think that it shows maybe a bit of an over-reliance on public education as just the assumed default of where things are going to be,
What can you tell us anything about the real life experience that might have prompted that kind of tweet?
I think I was being truthful when I said every teacher has had that experience. I'm a classroom teacher. I have been for 8 years, been public, been private. But I think everyone's had the experience of being in a room day after day with the same person kind of causing, disruption and in cases worse than mine of being violent and threatening. Every once in a while you have that day where they don't show up and it's like, oh, wow, everything could be running a bit more smoothly. I think that there's a place in the conversation, at least for, is the schooling system the place for those kids? And I don't want to be a hair trigger, give up on children, but potentially we could build better opportunities for them elsewhere.
I have been a university professor and I have been a high school teacher as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And here is the thing I've noticed about that. The person in the classroom who causes the problems becomes the sole focus of everyone's concern.
Yeah.
While you have somewhere between 15 and 29, 28 other students in the room who are, in fact, being held back by this one person.
Yes.
And nobody cares about the other 28 kids, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And because nobody cares. So, for example, let's just say you have a boy or a couple of boys in your class who are just not necessarily even bad kids, but they're rowdy. They talk all the time. They're loud.
Mm-hmm.
The shy girl can't get her question asked because literally I can't hear what she is saying.
Right.
And so the class, rather than like catering to the shy, studious girl, is all built around just trying to control the rowdy, loud boys because
Yeah.
there's no place, because they can't be removed. So, and so the situation is set up to punish the more studious, the more reserved, the quieter student. So it's
Yeah.
a weird situation in which you get punished for following the rules.
Yes. I mean, I've said for a long time that the largest expense in education is opportunity cost.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're so overly focused on where the problem lies, that is an opportunity cost to the other, as you mentioned, 15, 29 students in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the opportunity cost is paid in potential as well. You know, the potential of how far you could get with some of these other students who, although not perfect, are generally on board with the program. And I would just add as well that I was the kid who was taken away from other people's attention. I mean, in high school, that was me. I had made it my mission to be fairly disruptive and generally hard to get along with. So I have sympathy with those kids as well, even just from my own personal experience of being one. But I always look back on my own situation and think, well, maybe I could have been better served elsewhere as well.
Yeah. Why, do you know why you did that?
Oh, I was angry.
Yeah.
I was an angry teenager. I had some personal issues. I had a best friend die when I was pretty young.
Right.
I began to lash out in a lot of ways. And I discovered this horrible truth, which is that authority in a lot of ways is an agreement. And I decided not to hold up my end of the deal.
Right.
And became kind of a nightmare to deal with for a long time. So
Say more about what you mean when you say authority is an agreement.
Well, I remember thinking it through. We had this dean of students who was an ex-Marine. He was a hard man, and everybody was kind of terrified of him. And I remember thinking it through, like, what is he actually going to do? Like, if he's going to yell at me, I don't mind that too much. He's not going to rough me up. He's not going to, beat me up or anything like that. That was just all out of the question. So I realized that I can pretty much take over here, and there's not going to be any sort of consequence that I care about. But I think that other kids don't know that, or don't come to realize that, or just they don't look at it from that point of view. So maybe I'm speaking like that's an objective truth. Maybe it's just subjectively true for me. But I think that the minor consequences were enough to hold other people back. They didn't want to be yelled at. They didn't want to be problematic. They didn't want to be, generally shunned. So it's a two-way thing. The person who is in authority needs to understand and needs to grasp their own gravitas and impose that as much as possible. And then the other side of that is the student who needs to realize that maybe it's not worth it to cause problems.
I also, whenever I have the opportunity, discourage people from going to university for the same reason. That, especially because as a person who was a university professor for a long time, it's just as bad, if not worse, at that level, because as a professor, you're constantly teaching to the least motivated student.
Mm-hmm.
And so your lessons, what you spend time on in class, how you feel about teaching the class at all is dictated by the person who cares the least about it. And so especially now when there are so many more options for self-directing your own education, whether that's online learning, whatever it is. I think for the most serious and dedicated person, university is not even worth it. If for no other reason than simply because you have to be in a room with other students who literally don't care at all.
Yes.
And maybe that's more pronounced at the university level is when I say they don't care at all, people think I'm being hyperbolic, but what I mean is they don't care at all.
Right.
Yes.
So I'm going through my master's program right now, and going to get my principalship or curriculum design, one of those two things. And I wouldn't view it as worth it to be in there for the content if it weren't for the fact that I am just nakedly chasing a credential. And I think that maybe that does contribute to the lack of buy-in to some university students. And maybe in response, this might be, a two-way street in response to that, lack of buy-in. Now we have to water down the curriculum and all that. So, I wonder, it may be a chicken and egg situation, like which came first,
Well, here's what came first is that the president of generic state university X, what came first was the mortgage on his vacation home.
Yeah, yes.
And so that's the other thing is that most people, again, at the university level, don't really understand that what drives a university more than anything is the economic purchasing power of the highest levels of administration. And that you can talk about rhetoric all you want. You can talk about creating opportunities. You can talk about beautiful platitudes about education and uplift, but none of that would happen if people weren't getting paid. And that you cannot understand the contemporary university without understanding that it exists essentially to make money.
Yes.
And that in the end, that is all the vast majority of the administration certainly cares about. And because it's a job to them. And so how that translates to the classroom is we just need bodies in here who can qualify for a loan to bring us the cash. And so then you get a classroom where you got 28 kids out of 30 who don't care.
When you can see that transparently in the efforts to make the admissions standards really low. In the area that I'm in, students, they've pretty much, if you go to a Green Bay area public school, you have a free, not a free ride financially, but as far as your credentials go,
right,
to go right straight to that university. Well, a lot of teachers that I know talk about how, well, wasn't this great that, so many more people have an opportunity for an education. It's like, no, they're going to drop out after a year or two. The university is going to cash that check and they're just going to keep on letting them in.
Right. Yes.
So transparently about money in some situations.
And so once you have accepted that, okay, I told you before we started that my views on education may be more radical than yours. So I don't want to attribute anything I'm saying to you.
No, it's fine.
But once you have accepted that the entire educational structure, the entire official educational structure from, graduate programs at generic state university, graduate doctoral programs at generic state university, down to your neighborhood public kindergarten, once you've accepted that that's all a facade, it's all driven by the interests of powerful people, then then I think you begin to see it more clearly for what it is.
Yeah, well, and then there's people within the system who are trying their best to kind of return it to a more sane, institution, but they're essentially powerless.
Yes,
when that's what's happening at top. I feel it myself. I've been working on making sure that my craft is as good as it can possibly be, that my curriculum is good. I have quite a bit of freedom in what I teach. But in a way, I do sometimes begin to feel a little nihilistic about it, because it's like, I'm going there every day and I'm doing what I do, but I'm one person in a larger system that's not really serving these students. Those perverse incentives do ruin things.
Right. And I don't want to be taken as saying that there are no good public school teachers, et cetera,
Of course.
and things like that. What I'm saying is that their effort is fundamentally Sisyphean, right?
Yes.
In that they're at cross purposes with the larger system.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, I think, are trying to do good, but only because they don't actually see how things are.
Yes. Well, I always have kind of two minds about teachers. I get pushback fairly often about being an anti-teacher, and it's just not true. I am a teacher. All my friends are teachers. My wife is a teacher. I went into teaching very impassioned about, what I wanted to do. So I don't dislike teachers. I feel tremendous sympathy with them. Every once in a while, though, I feel like I meet a true believer, a true believer in, the things that I see as kind of ruining education. And those people I have disdain for. I'm like, why are you in this? Like, what is your game here?
How do you know a true believer when you see one?
Well, you can explain something. You can have it backed up by data. You can show them that, lax discipline in the classroom is harmful. You can explain it logically. You can have the deductive reasoning on your side and all of that. And they still are like, well, this kid, was up late last night, so I let him sleep in my class. Like, okay, well, I guess if that's what you think is right, then go for it. But that's ridiculous to me. And I really don't have much sympathy for you now when you talk about how no one's learning anything. So there are some, for every bad practice, there is a body of literature to back it up, right? For every good practice, there's a body of literature to back it up. But we're in the classroom and you're seeing the negative effects of what you're doing, and you still maintain that you need to persist in these practices. To me, you're just that's contemptible. You should at least see the evidence before your eyes and maybe try something different.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about the things that you've encountered as a teacher. So you said you began very impassioned. You've
Yes.
been doing it for 8 years. Have you had some experiences in those 8 years that have kind of shaped your current views?
Yeah. So I went through a fairly standard process of becoming a teacher. The only thing that was really different was that I started late in life. I took 9 years off between going to high school and going to college. And I went into college really believing that being an English teacher is what I wanted. I've always loved literature. I've always believed in the importance of education. So I took a long time to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. I went to college. I went through the same program that everybody else goes through. And I was probably slightly less skeptical just because of the fact that I had some life experience. I wasn't straight out of high school going into a new schooling setting and all of that. So I was somewhat skeptical, and there was some comments by professors that maybe I didn't have the correct disposition to be a teacher and stuff like that.
What brought that up?
I don't even remember exactly. I just remember one of the reviews that they had done of me. They said that they didn't think I had the correct disposition. I think if I were to try to hazard a guess, I remember getting in a discussion with them that at a certain point you are like teaching them stuff, though, right? Because they were all about you need to engender skills in them, and you teach the student. You don't teach your subject, or you teach your student, you don't teach your subject. And I remember being like, no, well, you do have to teach your subject at some point, though, right? So how do I do that? And then they didn't have any answers forthcoming because they were fully enmeshed in constructivist sort of methods of teaching. So I think that may have been my disposition was just incorrect according to them, because I thought that more kind of classical way of teaching was probably beneficial to students.
What, from their point of view, was the correct disposition?
So the universities, teaching colleges, a lot of them are really beholden to the idea of discovery learning, which under a different name was constructivism, which is the idea that a student can't really learn if you're teaching them directly. They have to discover it for yourself. When I read the literature on constructivism, though, they show that it's a confusion in terms, really. When you are being taught how to do something directly, you are constructing the knowledge, right? Your brain has no choice but to construct it on its own. If it doesn't, then you don't learn. But they took that truth about your cognitive functioning and they made it prescriptive, right? Instead of descriptive, they made it prescriptive. So the entire way of setting up learning experiences was to kind of, provide an environment, and not to provide an environment, to provide circumstance in which the kids somehow discover on their own, the things that you want them to learn. So that's the discovery method, constructivism kind of paradigm. Whereas, a lot of classical schools are more focused on discrete pieces of knowledge and sequencing them in such a way that one builds on the next. And when you look at the cognitive science of schemata in the brain, that's more congruent with that, right? Mm. So the fact that I was like, we need to teach, actual knowledge at some point, I put me at odds with them, and I quickly learned there that I needed to play their game to make my way through it. Mm-hmm. Which isn't to say that I was like so sage and wise about everything, because I definitely did buy into a lot of, their theory on behavior management and, all of that stuff, and kind of really taking into account the identity characteristics of students when deciding how to deal with them or whatever. But when you get into the classroom, all of that stuff just falls to the wayside. Very quickly, you find out that you need consistent standards, you need consistent behavioral practices, and you need like a progressive system of, how do you deal with these behaviors, and you start small and it progressively gets, bigger, you escalate. So yeah, I guess to continue the original question, getting into the classroom and seeing everything that they told me to do just fail was a real wake up call for me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What works?
Well, for the past several years now, I've read, my E.D. Hirsch, who's probably, in my opinion, the most important educational theorist to come down the pike in a long time. But he came out in 1986 with his educational theory, so that tells you about his influence. And then through, just kind of a series of, blind luck, really, I found Daniel Willingham and other cognitive scientists who are focused on education. So what I find works is teaching discrete knowledge, sequencing it in such a way that one thing builds on the next. Memorization is important for education. If you don't have a base of facts at your disposal, you can't reason critically about something. You can't reason critically about something that you don't know anything about. If I were to try to talk at length right now about quantum mechanics, I would sound like an idiot. And I think that that's kind of what we're asking students to do often, is we're asking them to exposit at length about things that we never really taught them about. So I think we need to reverse that and teach them, discrete knowledge bits, make them memorize, build the next thing on top of that until they become little mini experts in their fields, and then they have something to say. I think to center the student rather than to center the work is an exact reversal of what would be correct, which seems to be kind of the main thing that's in vogue in modern education. It's just really student-centered methods rather than, letting them know that there is a wisdom, there is a tradition of knowledge that they could access with work, but they can't discover it on their own out of whole cloth. You have to teach them it first.
You mentioned that you've been tweeting a lot about NAEP results. What is that?
Yeah, so NAEP it's where you get the school report cards from. The National Assessment of Educational Progress is the acronym, and they do reports every few years where they release basically district by district, state by state, and then a picture of the whole country of how kids are doing in 4th grade and 8th grade in both reading and math.
Uh-huh.
These numbers are just released on, was it Thursday or Friday? And it turns out that we have historically low numbers in 4th grade reading across the country. Almost every single state showed a drop in their numbers for that.
What does that mean? A drop in the numbers indicates what?
It just indicates that they're not scoring as high on the standardized tests that NAEP is measuring as they gather this data. So there's four levels that they can score at, and it's advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic. And what the NAEP results showed is that I believe it was a full 30% of students scored below basic. Now, below basic is practically functionally illiterate. And studies show that the scores, the students who score low in 3rd grade will tend to continue to score low throughout the rest of their academic career. Mm-hmm. So the fact that in 4th grade, we're showing almost a third of students not reading at even a basic level does not bode well for their futures.
Mm-hmm. Early on, when in my university teaching career, I had assigned a popular level book, a book written at, I don't know what the standard popular level book is written at, not 10th grade reading level or something.
Sure.
And I had a student, probably a college sophomore, junior at that point, come in and say, I can't read this book. Mm-hmm. And I thought he was saying that he couldn't access it, like he couldn't find it on Amazon, he couldn't get it in the books or whatever. And sure. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I can't understand what it's saying.
Yeah.
And so he was 2 or 3 years into college at that point and was essentially unable to read and follow the argument of a popular level book. And at that point, I realized, I think part of the problem here is that for all intents and purposes, the vast majority of my students are functionally illiterate, mm-hmm. defined as being unable to read a standard popular level text and follow an argument in it. Mm-hmm. If that is the definition of functional illiteracy, then the vast majority of college students I knew were functionally illiterate.
Yeah.
Even at the point of graduation. Mm-hmm. What's the root of that in 4th grade? Why can't kids read?
Yeah. So, then did you watch or listen to the Sold the Story podcast from Emily Hanford?
I have not, but tell me a little about it and tell me what you want to say about it.
So she showed that basically the Teachers College at Columbia University, they have a very influential professor there named Lucy Calkins. And she had built basically a large following by starting to teach the whole word method of reading. So an early literacy instruction, rather than teaching phonics systematically, she said that.
What's the difference? Explain what's that mean?
Yeah, so phonics it's dependent on breaking the alphabetic code, right? There are these letters and they correspond to sounds. And once you learn the sounds and how they correspond to the letters, you can piece them together and start to blend them. And then ideally, before that, you already had a big enough vocabulary that when you hear the sound that you're reading based off the code that you broke, you would already know that word. And then, that's how reading happens. Mm-hmm. Well, there was one study, and I'm not going to be able to cite the name of it or when it was released, but that showed that people who are expert at reading, they take in information at the whole word level. So Lucy Calkins and Fontes and Pinnell, who's another influential reading instruction couple, posited from there that, well, if you just teach the whole word, then the students will be able to learn a lot more quickly, and then they'll become expert readers a lot more quickly as well. Okay, so that's the theory. But when you do better and more targeted studies, you actually find out that people do develop to the point where they start to take in the whole word. But when they come across a word that's unfamiliar to them, they still have to revert back to the alphabetic code thing and break it down. You can actually subjectively experience this if you're trying to read, Finnegan's Wake or something like that. You're going to have to deal with the phonemes and figure out exactly how to break those things apart. So she became very influential, Lucy Calkins, and Fontes and Pinnell. Calkins has kind of become the face of this, but they're equally culpable here. She became the face of this movement to teach kids how to read by the whole word. And some of the methods that they would do would be to, have every reading text accompanied by pictures so that they'd be able to guess, right? So if it says it has a picture of a pony, but the word is horse. So that became confusing for some kids. Another thing that they would do is try to teach the shape of words. If you could, let's take the horse example again. The first letter is tall, and then there's 4 short letters after that. Well, if you can start to recognize these patterns, these shapes of words, you can take them in wholly, and then again access that expert reading level that they possibly was true. This is based on faulty studies, right? And they've shown that systematic teaching of phonics is much better for being able to deal with unfamiliar words, especially. That's part of it. The other part of it is people used to be in more, or some people are in more language-rich environments. So they just have that base of vocabulary at their ready when they do start to piece together those letter-sound correspondences. So things like reading to your kids early, just being in a house of educated people who speak in more complicated syntax, who use a vocabulary that's not, at that 8th grade level that newspapers are written at, all of that sort of stuff helps build the vocabulary of these kids early so that when they are taught phonics, they then are able to connect it to their vocabulary that they know. And then you continue to build, knowledge through reading, real works. And then over time, those kids just have such a store of knowledge that they're reading a lot better. So this is a 2-pronged problem here then. They're not being taught the letter sound correspondence, and at the same time, they're not getting that knowledge, that body of knowledge. So this is why we see a lot of times that gap start at 3rd grade. It's been called the Matthew effect, named after a verse in Matthew. Those who have a lot will be given more. Those who have none,
even what they have will be taken.
Yes. Okay, so they call it the Matthew effect because kids who were set up from the beginning with all of this good instruction that I had just described will just continue to advance and advance and advance, whereas those who have not will continue to go further and further down. And the reason why that happens at 3rd grade is because that's when most schools start to read the actual books. So then you see that gap just widen over the years. So the fact that there are more people in public school than ever in history, and the fact that public schools are up until recently beholden to this whole word method, and the fact that we're not putting books in hands that are any more complicated than watching a TV show, we're crippling kids, especially those who aren't in households that are doing all the right things for them.
But who benefits from that?
I mean, Lucy Calkins benefited quite a bit. Heinemann benefited quite a bit. Textbook companies, Basel readers, a lot of those people benefited from it. If you look at the increase in administration and spending in schools, a lot of people are in positions that didn't even exist 20 years ago. I mean, you look at those charts of school spending versus school achievement, they're astounding.
Because we're paying people to fix problems that the system created.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there are, I had mentioned to you before we started about Louisiana being a bright spot.
Uh-huh.
Louisiana has gone from something like the 44th ranked state in reading at the 4th grade level. That was 2019 when that was released, to now they're the 16th. They were the one school that showed really significant growth. Mississippi showed some growth as well, but Louisiana grew 6 points in that those NAEP results. Every other state is tanking, so their
How did they
scores
do
are
it?
going down.
How did
Sorry.
they do it in Louisiana?
What do they do in Louisiana? So at the state level, they now are saying public schools have to teach according to phonics, and they worked with E.D. Hirsch, who's my favorite guy, on creating Bayou Bridges, which is that sequence knowledge that I had talked about before. E.D. Hirsch has his own curriculum company called the Core Knowledge Foundation, and they worked in conjunction with policymakers in Louisiana to make sure that that curriculum is getting into their schools. So it's a huge vindication for those who have been saying that we need to get back to systematic phonics teaching and that we need to start teaching knowledge-based curriculum instead of isolated skills. So,
have you ever seen those videos? I don't know if they still do them, but a few years ago they were doing them often on the Jimmy Kimmel show, where they would go out on this Hollywood Boulevard or whatever, and they would stop people and say, what ocean borders California? This would be in California. And people would say the Arctic, or they would say, who is the current vice president? People have no idea.
Right.
And one of the things I've written on Twitter before is that it's hard to take an accurate accounting of social problems in American culture without just dealing with how incredibly ignorant the average person is.
Yes.
And that contributes massively to all kinds of social maladies. So the question is, how can we have a gargantuan, invasive, extraordinarily expensive public education system and a totally ignorant public?
Yeah, I think it speaks a lot to those perverse incentives that we're pointing at before.
Mm-hmm.
I do also think that there are just some cultural memes in place that have had some really pernicious and negative effects. Again, the idea that we're centering students' whims, more so than anything else, more so than what's actually good for them. I think that there's a very misguided tendency to think that empathy and compassion requires that we give kids what they want. And I've been calling this the child worship cult, which inevitably turns into the child sacrifice cult. You can't let kids over to their own devices. Otherwise they will self-destruct. And I think you see that in all sorts of areas, and schooling is one of them. And schooling, our public schools are largely employed by very empathetic people. And as I mentioned earlier, I think you need to kind of grapple with your own gravitas and figure out how to be that authority. And I think there are people who are not positioned very well to do that. And I think we're letting kids kind of run rampant. And we're seeing results on that as well. So I think it's a combination of multiple factors really ruining it,
To touch on something you said earlier, you said that in your undergraduate education program, you sort of stood out as a person who's kind of questioning some of these doctrines. Isn't the implication of that then that the vast majority of teachers themselves are not particularly educated people equipped with very serious skills of critical thinking, people who have a kind of E.D. Hirsch-like cultural literacy? If you survey people coming out of bachelor's level education programs, I couldn't say for certain, but I'm 99% sure that you're not going to find people like I've just described.
Yeah, I mean, you can even quantify this somewhat because they show that the people who enter the colleges of education score lower on ACTs than any other major.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a test that you have to take to become a teacher. It's called the Praxis, and it's meant to be, the thing that proves that you know what you're talking about. There are multiple states that, if they haven't already gotten rid of it, have proposed getting rid of it. I took the test. It was really easy. It's very basic and easy stuff. I've mentioned this online before about how you talk to an English teacher about anything outside of this exact subject that they teach, the exact material that they teach. You find that they don't know much about language, about literature, about grammar, about a lot of important things that you'd think an English teacher would know about. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean to be overly disparaging, I've worked with some brilliant colleagues as well. But by and large, I think that we're not getting the best and the brightest, just to put it bluntly.
Mm-hmm. I've seen online often the little meme, and I don't know that this is scientifically rigorous, but it is intuitively, it comports with my intuitive sense. Sure. Of college majors by average IQ, where physics is at the top and education is almost always near the bottom.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we would change that, except to make education degree somehow much more difficult. But how could we make an education degree as difficult as a physics degree? I don't know. Right.
Well, and then there's the problem of who do you staff the schools with?
Right.
Well, Robert Pondicio makes this point a lot, is that we have the staff that we have, so we need people who are intelligent at the policy level, making teaching idiot proof. It's, as a profession, it could be easy to overcomplicate it, but I think every teacher is capable of knowing how to read a book, right? And of transmitting that knowledge to someone younger than them. I think they're capable of that. I think there are some bad pedagogical processes that are in vogue right now that don't encourage teachers to know more. So again, I think there are some systemic barriers to really fixing it, but I don't think it's necessarily intractable.
You're an English teacher. What texts are you teaching? How do students respond?
I'm teaching Huck Finn right now. So that was another flashpoint recently. I had been discouraged from teaching it from some colleagues, but going ahead with it just because of the controversy surrounding the board, basically.
The racial controversy associated with it, is that what you mean?
Yeah. So it was told to me that it could potentially be problematic, but I talked to my principal and I was like, here's my plan. And she was fine with it. And so it's not a big deal, but, I teach according to literary periods. So we start with colonial literature. We talk, I teach a little bit of history alongside so that they can contextualize the works that we're reading. So we talk about the Puritans, and then we move on to the Romantics. So one of my classes is American literature. So we go Puritans, then the Romantics, and then
when you teach American Romanticism, whom do you teach?
So William Cullen Bryant, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Whitman.
And what Emerson do you teach?
Self-reliance.
And how do students respond? Are these sophomores, juniors, seniors?
They're sophomores, yeah.
And what do they think of
Actually,
Emerson?
they loved the Romantic unit. Yeah, they loved reading those guys. So
why?
Well, I think I don't know. I feel like there's a romantic inside all of us, right? I think it speaks to some aspects of human nature that, the yearning and the wanting to be free and self-directed and, all of that. I think it appeals to teenagers especially.
Do you teach Thoreau?
No, we don't have. Largely, it's a resource problem when I don't have the text at the school and can't get a hold of it.
Yes, those poor guys, such wonderful writers and so spectacularly wrong.
Yes, yeah.
I was just thinking the other day about Thoreau, and at the end of Walden, he talks about humanity as this kind of worm in an old desk that has been asleep for hundreds of years, and it crawls out when it awakens, and that the humanity's just in its larval stage, and we're going to break forth into this kind of wonderful, wonderful new being.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not, Henry.
I love the romantic poetry. I love what is it? The West Wind by Shelley is one of my favorite poems ever written, and it's just beautiful, right? But I think the spirit of romanticism, in a lot of ways, is encapsulated in Rousseau's Emile, and I think that's not a good thing. So I love the poets, but I don't necessarily love the philosophy.
Sure. What else do you teach that students respond to?
So students, let's see, they really love 1984 right now.
Oh, wow.
1984. They actually surprisingly really liked The Importance of Being Earnest.
Oh, well, why is that surprising?
I thought the language would be too much of a barrier, as we discussed. A lot of times it doesn't seem like they're accessing the text, but they really liked it. The girls especially were
funny.
Yeah, I think it's hilarious. I was just a little worried that it wasn't going to be received very well. We read Frankenstein. That kind of went over not great.
It's a hard book.
It is a hard book. Yeah. And I think I probably could have contextualized it a little bit better as well. I didn't really talk too extensively about how that's an outgrowth of the Romantic period and, the Gothic literature coming from the Romantic literature. So I hadn't really contextualized that, I think, probably as well as I could have. And then just it is, his sentences are paragraphs,
right.
Her sentences are paragraphs. Jeez, don't get that wrong.
There are times where she describes what's happening in that book kind of obliquely, and it's not immediately clear what she's even what action is going on in the narrative.
Yeah. And then the narrative frames, I think, were a little difficult, I think that you just kind of, it's like Inception, it's a story within a story. So I think they kind of lost track a little bit, but it was my first time teaching it actually. So
sure.
I'm always looking to figure out how to do it better next time. So.
All right. So James Furey, let's say you somehow magically you're in charge of American education. What do you do to fix it?
Oof. Well, I do think that we take a state like Louisiana and we try to replicate to a certain extent. I am a big believer in school choice and opening it up so that, part of my solution to the removal of those 2-3 kids that I talked about that we began a conversation with is there are people who know how to teach those kids, or maybe those kids need to be in an apprenticeship working,
Yes.
Maybe certainly they have talents that lie outside of reading Frankenstein in my classroom,
Right.
So let's open up the possibilities. Let's open up an educational entrepreneurial spirit so that people who have ideas on how to manage those students maybe better than I can in a context of 30 students have the opportunity to do so, and find out what works there and scale it, So I think school choice is essential to kind of figuring out some of the public education woes, but I'm not of the opinion that we get rid of public schools. I think that for a large proportion of the population, they're necessary. So I want to reform. Again, looking at what Louisiana did, phonics-based instruction from early on, looking at what Edie Hirsch says, looking at real, classroom management, it drives me nuts when people say things like, a noisy classroom is a learning one. It's like, no, maybe a calm one, maybe a calm one.
Right.
Let's talk about how to get these kids actually thinking about the material that we want them to think about, and let's give them real material. So I think there are some just wonky pedagogical things that need to happen there, as far as, making sure that you are having a calm and orderly classroom. Because again, that quiet, shy girl that you talked about in the room, she's not served by chaotic, and the kid who's being quiet about his home life being crazy and violent, he's not served by that environment being replicated in the place of your schoolroom. So
that's a great point.
We really need to focus on making schools places of calm and of safety and where kids want to be. And we need to get real books in their hands, and we need to teach them how to read, and we need to teach them about history from an early age. And, if that takes more of a focus on some of that stuff than on cutting out shapes with scissors, then we should do that. I think big policy picture, school choice, and then probably 1,000 small policy things like the ones I was just mentioning.
Are you online anywhere except Twitter?
No, I'm just a Twitter guy.
Okay, so people can find you on Twitter at James Furey.
Yep, James A. Furey on Twitter.
Furey.
Yes, yeah, like the Joyce character.
Great, very good. All right, well, thanks for talking.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. This is a nice conversation.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Yep.